Hey everyone, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're slowing things down to explore a tough but important topic. Why being a woman in the Middle Ages was horrible, a nightmare. Life back then wasn't kind, especially for women. And we'll quietly walk through the everyday struggles, silent hardships, and hidden strength it took just to survive. No drama, just calm, thoughtful storytelling to help you reflect, relax, and slowly drift into sleep. So get comfortable and let the quiet side of history carry you off tonight. Asterisk, the marriage market. When girls were dowries. Asterisk, you wake to the sound of roosters crowing, and you are 12. You are not a child anymore, though your knees still bruise easily, and your braids haven't come undone since your last festival dance. The wooden shutters creak open, and you see your father speaking with two men. You know what they're talking about. You're not supposed to know, but you do. They're negotiating your dowry in the Middle Ages. Girls, particularly in merchant and noble households, were not raised to dream of love. They were raised to be traded. A dowry wasn't just a gift, it was a transactional payment meant to secure a daughter's marriage. Land, silver, livestock, bolts of cloth. More likely, she would be sent to a conventor, remain unmarried and burdensome. This was true in the courts of France, the towns of England, and the hill villages of Italy. From the high castles to the low market stalls, a daughter's future lay in coin and calculation. A girl might be as young as 7 when the first marriage discussions were held. By the age of 12 or 13, if her family was eager, her hand would already be promised. Often, the man on the other end of the agreement was much older, richer, and unconcerned with her personhood. The lucky ones were the noble daughters, bathed in gold and perfumed oils. But these young women had even less control over their fate. Before they turned 20, their wombs were treaties, their hands signatures inked in flesh. In villages, it was no different, just smaller scale. A father might give his daughter and a cow to the neighbor's son in exchange for a patch of land to farm. Girls were commodities valued based on family reputation, purity, and how many acres they could bring with them. And the question of purity, that was a terrifying burden. A woman accused of not being a virgin before marriage, even falsely, could be rejected or worse. Some were even killed in honor killings, especially in patriarchal societies bordering medieval Europe, where family name was tied directly to a woman's body. In Italy, especially in cities like Florence and Venice, entire dowry registries were maintained. Poorer girls were caught in a loop of rejection and abandonment, was seen as disruptive, even dangerous. The church wanted marriages to be consensual in theory, but in practice, the consent of a 12-year-old bride was considered legally valid if she said yes once. That yes might be whispered through fear, or not at all. In legal records, across England and Germany, thousands of marriages were simply recorded based on family agreement, with no mention of the girl's wishes. And once married, the dowry ensured something chilling. The wife became property. She was absorbed into her husband's household, and her dowry could be used, sold, or withheld from her at will. If her husband died, she might receive a small portion back as a widow's dowry, but only if explicitly stated in the contract. Many widows had nothing but the clothes they wore. The richer the dowry, the higher the pressure. A girl who came with land was expected to manage it and produce heirs. A girl who came with gold was expected to be quiet and not question where it went. Marriages were less about companionship and more about survival, status, and control. A girl who complained too much might be sent away. A girl who disobeyed could be beaten. And a girl who failed to produce children, she might be replaced. This wasn't considered cruelty, was seen as order. Families believed they were doing what was right. A well-married daughter increased the family's standing. A poorly matched one could bring shame, or worse, financial ruin. No one thought to ask how the daughter felt. In most records, her voice is absent, but sometimes her resistance is hinted at. In hidden diaries, scribbled in convent margins, an older merchant. Their stories remind us that silence was not always agreement. Tit was often survival. And in that silence, what did girls think of the husbands chosen for them? What did they dream of the night before the wedding, lying beside the chest of linen, given as part of their dowry? You wonder, too. You wonder what it felt like, waking up in a stranger's house, called wife by someone you never chose, and whether you would have been considered lucky if your dowry was just a bit more valuable. You step over the threshold of your husband's house. You don't know if you're supposed to speak. Your new mother-in-law stares at you with the measuring gaze of someone appraising a goat. The room is dark, made darker by the heavy timber beams, and it smells faintly of smoke and wool. This is your new life, and nothing about it is yours. In the Middle Ages, once a girl was married, no matter how young she entered a world where her identity disappeared. The church taught that man was the head of the household and woman was to be obedient. Canon law reinforced this hierarchy. A wife owed her husband's submission, sexual availability, and management of his home. In return, he owed her protection. That protection was loosely defined. If a husband hit his wife, the church might advise him to stop, unless she provoked it. For noble women, married life was often cold and political. They were required to produce male heirs as quickly as possible, often giving birth every year or two. The strain on their bodies was immense. Many died in childbirth, especially by their mid-20s. Records show that high-born women like Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, bore children at 13. Her pelvic bones hadn't even fully formed yet. Her son lived. She never conceived again. In peasant families, the expectations were equally heavy, just different. A wife was expected to manage the household, tend a small garden, raise children, mend clothes, care for animals, and assist her husband in the fields. She might rise before dawn to fetch water or grind grain. She would carry that burden for decades, usually barefoot and pregnant, with few moments of rest. There were no romantic evenings, no shared laughter around a warm hearth, just exhaustion and duty. What made this more horrifying was the legal landscape. In many medieval legal systems, women could not own property independently once married. Their land became their husband's. Their income, if they had any, went to him. They could not sign contracts, appear in court without his permission, or, in some cases, even leave home without his consent. They were legally covered by their husbands, a term that meant they had no legal identity of their own. This system of coverture was common in English common law, but similar principles existed elsewhere in Europe. In France, the term was puissance marital. In Germany, it was Munt. No matter the name, the effect was the same. The wife had no voice unless the husband gave it to her. And if a woman resisted, well, the church had ways to correct that. Disobedient wives might be subject to public shaming. In England and parts of Germany, a woman deemed a scold, that is, too talkative or argumentative, might be sentenced to wear the scold's bridle. It was an iron mask or cage placed over the head, often with a tongue depressor made of metal that would cut the mouth if she tried to speak. It was worn in public to mock and humiliate. Some bridles even had bells attached so that everyone could hear her coming. Her voice became a warning. In Italy, women might be locked indoors as punishment for disobedience. Venetian records show cases where wives were confined for weeks or months by angry husbands, and if a woman tried to flee, in most cases, she would be returned to her husband. She had no legal standing to request a divorce unless extreme abuse could be proven, and, even then, it was rare. Annulments were sometimes granted by the church, but these were usually for wealthy families who could pay for the process, and even then only under exceptional circumstances like consanguinity, being too closely related. Some women tried to survive by wielding quiet power. A clever wife might gain influence over household servants or manage estate affairs if her husband was away at war. In a few rare cases, noble women even ruled temporarily in their husband's absence. Eleanor of Aquitaine governed lands during King Richard's crusade, but these examples were exceptions, not the rule. Most women had no say in politics, law, or even family decisions. Even the naming of children often rested with the husband. There's a phrase in many medieval law books: the husband shall correct his wife. That correction could range from scolding to beating, and it was considered acceptable as long as it did not cause death. This disturbing concept of moderate chastisement was legally supported across much of medieval Europe. Some husbands were kind, surely, but the law was on the side of those who weren't. Perhaps the hardest thing was the isolation. A girl who married into another town often lost touch with her family. Travel was difficult, and letters were rare. She might not see her mother again. She might spend the rest of her life with strangers who only tolerated her if she worked hard and bore children. And if her husband died early, something not uncommon due to war or disease, she might be blamed for his misfortune, especially if the marriage had been unhappy or childless. Widows sometimes had more freedom, at least in theory, but they were often targeted for remarriage quickly, especially if they had land or wealth attached. The same cycle began again, often with even less enthusiasm. A widow with no sons or male relatives to protect her might lose everything. Imagine living in a house where every decision is made for you, where your thoughts are not considered and your feelings are not recorded. Imagine sitting by a window, watching the seasons pass, knowing that you are more a servant than a spouse, and yet you are called wife. It sounds beautiful in theory. In practice, it was a cage. There were women who found pockets of joy, perhaps in their children or in moments of community with other women. But these moments were hard-won and often fleeting. The dominant experience was silence, endurance, and invisibility. And still, you wonder if a girl had dared to speak against it, if she had refused, shouted, or run, what might have happened to her. Were there any who escaped? Or were all of them, in the end, just absorbed into someone else's story? The years pass, and you learn how to smile at the right times. You manage the servants without being accused of arrogance. You bear your children in silence, grip the bedposts during the pain, and thank the saints when both you and the baby survive. You visit the market in town once a week, clutching your husband's coin pouch like a lifeline. You do not speak unless spoken to. You survive. And in the Middle Ages, that counted as success. For most women in medieval Europe, the defining skill wasn't embroidery or cooking. It was quiet endurance. Girls entered marriage barely trained for the responsibilities ahead. No one taught them how to give birth safely, how to comfort a feverish child, or how to budget food for a winter famine. They were expected to know, and if they didn't, the blame was theirs. This pressure was relentless. There was no childhood as we think of it today. Once married, a girl became a woman in the eyes of society, even if she still played with dolls the year before. A 14-year-old wife managing a household of 6 was not rare. Neither was a 16-year-old mother who had already buried a child. In noble homes, this burden came with ritual. There were precise expectations. The perfect wife must be pious, modest, fertile, and well-spoken, but not too outspoken. Books like La Ménagère de Paris, The Goodman of Paris, were written to instruct young brides on how to behave. A husband in the late 1300s wrote the book for his much younger wife, detailing how she should cook, pray, garden, and submit to him with humility. It was, disturbingly, meant as a kind gesture, a guide for living well. In the countryside, there were no books, just survival. Women were expected to wake before dawn, tend the fire, feed the livestock, bake bread, fetch water, mend clothing, spin wool, raise children, and help in the fields. There was no rest, even on holy days, and there were no midwives if you lived too far from a town. Many women gave birth alone, or with the help of their mothers or sisters if they were lucky. Death in childbirth was so common that it was sometimes listed as a cause of death, simply as natural fate. Despite all this, women found small ways to carve space for themselves. In markets, they built relationships. They whispered news to each other, shared herbs for pain, taught younger girls to manage their bodies as best they could. In convents, nuns kept records, taught girls to read, and offered the only real alternative to marriage, though even convents came with strict obedience to male bishops. In artisan towns, some widows managed their late husbands' workshops, continuing the trade as femme sole, a rare legal category for independent women in some medieval cities. These women left traces, brief ones, but real. And then there were stories, not fairy tales, but warnings passed down from mother to daughter. Don't speak too freely in front of men. Don't go to the well alone. Don't let the midwife see your bruises. These were the survival tools of medieval womanhoods, silent, practical, and soaked in fear. If a woman was accused of adultery, she could be stoned, whipped, or sent away. If she miscarried, and someone suspected poison or sin, she might face an inquiry. Women were always one rumor away from disgrace. Even the clothing reflected their place. A woman's headdress signaled her status and morality. Unmarried girls wore their hair down, but married women were required to cover their heads. In some towns, women accused of immodesty were forced to wear special garments, marking their shame. Appearance wasn't fashion, it was survival. And yet, within these strict roles, Some women made lives worth remembering. They educated their children when no one else would. They passed on herbal knowledge, managed complicated households, negotiated land rents, and healed others in secret. They preserved traditions through song and story. Their names may not appear in history books, but they shaped every generation after them. Still, the system remained brutally unfair. Even in death, a woman's value was weighed by her obedience. A good wife was mourned quietly. A difficult one was barely mentioned. Many gravestones from the Middle Ages list women only as wife of or mother of. Their names were secondary, their lives anonymous. But archaeology sometimes reveals more. In buried villages, researchers find women's tools: spindle, whorls, combs, thimbles, worn-down knives. In one grave in York, a woman was buried with beads in her hands, perhaps from a broken necklace, perhaps rosary beads. We will never know her name, but we know she lived. We know she worked, prayed, hoped, and probably feared, just like millions of other women who filled the silence of history with their invisible labor. As you settle beneath your blanket tonight, you may wonder what might have changed if women had been allowed to speak louder, own more, choose freely. Would the world have shaped itself differently? Or would it still have found new ways to silence them? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how many women today still carry the weight of a dowry they never chose? Wombs for the kingdom, the burden of royal fertility, asterisk. You wake in a chamber with stone walls and silken curtains that cannot keep out the chill. There is gold thread in your sheets and embroidered lions on the drapes. Servants speak in hushed voices as they stoke the fire. Outside the window, trumpets call for morning prayers, but they are not calling for you. They are calling for your womb. You are a queen now, or perhaps a princess, newly wed to a man 20 years older. Your crown gleams, but it is heavy, and not because of the metal. It is heavy because your body is now state property. Your value, your survival, your entire legacy depends on what happens inside your belly. In medieval Europe, royal women were prized not for their thoughts or ambitions, but for their reproductive potential. A queen's first and highest duty was to produce heirs, preferably male. The health and future of dynasties, the peace between kingdoms, and the legitimacy of entire governments hinged on this singular biological function. She could not rule in her own right in most places, but she could make kings. Consider Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who married into the English crown. First, she married Prince Arthur, who died young. Then she married his brother, Henry VIII. Her fate was already defined by the cradles she was expected to fill. She gave birth at least 6 times, but only one child, Mary, survived. Catherine's repeated miscarriages were not seen as tragedies. They were seen as failures. Failures that would eventually cost her her crown and her marriage. The burden of fertility was merciless. If a queen produced sons, she was celebrated. If she did not, she was often blamed, even though medieval medicine had no understanding of genetics or reproductive science. The man might have been sterile, but the woman carried the shame. Monarchs like Henry VIII blamed their wives, never themselves. And when disappointment repeated itself, miscarriage, stillbirth, infant death, in some courts, witnesses were present during the bedding ceremony to confirm consummation. When a pregnancy was announced, it was not just family news, it was a matter of state. And when a child was born, midwives, physicians, and royal officials gathered to witness the birth. There had to be no doubt that the child was legitimate, that the queen had done her duty. Imagine being watched during the most private, vulnerable moments of your life, laboring for hours, sometimes days, without privacy, blood everywhere, screaming into a pillow while old men outside the room waited to see if your cries ended in a baby's wail or in silence. And the pressure didn't end with childbirth. The moment a royal boy was born, he was taken from the mother. Queens were often separated from their newborns within days or weeks. Wet nurses and governesses raised the children. The queen might see her son only during formal visits. If the baby died, she was expected to grieve quietly and begin again. The emotional toll of this role was devastating. The historical record rarely shows how queens truly felt, but glimpses survive in letters, confessions, and quiet resistance. Anne Boleyn, also married to Henry VIII, suffered multiple miscarriages after delivering one living daughter, Elizabeth. She sensed her position crumbling with every lost pregnancy. She lost her life not long after in France. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was called unnatural when she dared to express exhaustion after giving birth to 12 children. And Queen Blanche of Castile, the mother of Louis IX, was revered for her piety, but even she was rumored to have wept for months after her miscarriages. Their grief was real, but rarely acknowledged. For many royal women, their value expired after menopause. Once they could no longer bear children, their influence diminished unless they had already secured power as a queen mother. Dowager queens often retreated to convents or rural palaces. Some wielded quiet power behind the scenes. Others were discarded, replaced by younger brides. The kingdom no longer needed them. This reality was not limited to the West. In Byzantium, imperial women were monitored in much the same way. In the Islamic world, caliphs' wives and concubines bore the political responsibility of producing sons. In China's imperial court, a woman's rise or fall depended entirely on her ability to bear sons for the emperor. The Empress Dowager Cixi, centuries later, rose only because her son became emperor. Without a son, she would have vanished into obscurity. And yet, in this harsh system, some queens fought back not with swords or laws, but with silence, maneuvering, and survival. They used their limited power to protect daughters, to broker marriages, to write letters, to educate themselves and others. Fertility may have defined their worth in the eyes of men, but it was not the only legacy they left behind. As the fire in your chamber burns low, you wrap your arms around your stomach and wonder if your child is a girl, what world awaits her? Will she too be judged by the emptiness or fullness of her womb? Or will she be allowed to matter for something more? You are not alone in the room, though it often feels that way. The chambermaids bow but avoid your eyes. The court physician frowns and scribbles notes when you sneeze. The midwife touches your belly like it belongs to someone else. And outside the walls, your entire kingdom holds its breath, waiting to know whether you are carrying a son. A boy will secure the throne. A boy will silence the whispers about your worth. A boy will ensure your place in the chronicles of history. But what if it's not a boy? What if your body fails again? These questions are not your own. They are fed to you daily. 1,000 eyes are watching your belly swell, watching your appetite, your color, your sleep. You are no longer a woman, you are a vessel. Royal pregnancies were more public than private. When a medieval queen became pregnant, the announcement was political. News. Her diet was controlled, her movements limited, and her bedroom guarded. In England, beginning in the late 14th century, a queen would enter confinement around 1 month before her due dates, secluding herself in a specially prepared chamber. Tapestries covered the windows, candles replaced sunlight. Only women were allowed inside. It was supposed to be restful. In reality, it was a gilded prison where anxiety hung as thick as the incense. During this time, a queen was expected to pray, rest, and prepare spiritually for childbirth, which was considered one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. Childbirth was deadly even for peasants, but for queens, the stakes were far more than physical. A dead queen could be mourned and replaced. A living one who failed to produce an heir could be cast aside with quiet cruelty or loud disgrace. Queens like Anne of Bohemia, who married Richard II of England, bore no children and were remembered only for their kindness. Others were not so fortunate. Margaret of Anjou gave birth to only 1 child during her marriage to Henry VI. When civil war erupted, her political enemies used this single heir as proof of her weak position. Rumors spread that the boy was illegitimate. They accused her of adultery, of scheming, of being too powerful for a woman. 1 child was not enough to protect her in France. Catherine de' Medici faced years of infertility after marrying Henry II. She was mocked, pitied, and nearly cast aside. Only through persistence, medicinal experimentation, and perhaps sheer luck did she eventually produce 10 children. She later ruled as regent and wielded extraordinary political influence, but that power came only after proving her womb's worth. This silent contract between crown and uterus shaped not only marriages, but entire kingdoms. Treaties were signed based on the assumption of future heirs. Armies marched depending on whether a prince had been born. If a queen died in childbirth, the alliance that came with her dowry might collapse. If a son died young, civil war could erupt. Your blood could spark a rebellion or prevent one. The moment of birth was no reprieve. Laboring women endured unimaginable pain without modern medicine. Childbirth was performed with crude tools, herbal remedies, and prayers. Survival. But miracles were rare. More common were fevers, blood loss, and silence. The mortality rate for women in childbirth was staggeringly high. In England and France, it's estimated that between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 women died due to complications of pregnancy and birth. A royal title offered little protection, and should the queen survive, should her child be healthy and male there, was no guarantee of celebration. The newborn was often taken from her immediately. Royal infants were considered too valuable to be raised by their mothers. They were placed in the care of wet nurses and servants, and later tutored by court-appointed educators. The queen might be allowed to visit, but rarely to raise. If the child died in infancy, the queen might weep in private, but in public she was expected to maintain grace, to prepare again to bear the next. A life lost did not lessen the demand. She bore a son, but her husband openly abandoned her for a mistress. The mistress, Eleanor de Guzman, bore multiple children, and Alfonso publicly favored them. Maria was humiliated, not for failing to give birth, but for losing control of the narrative. Even a fertile queen could be discarded if her influence waned. And then there was Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. She was thought to be mentally unstable, partly perhaps due to years of pregnancies and political manipulation. She bore 6 children, including future emperors and queens. But her emotional outbursts, her grief, her expressions of love or sorrow were labeled madness. Her womb was honored. The rest of her was locked away. These women were not just royal wives, they were symbols. They were expected to embody virtue, fertility, obedience, and faith. Any deviation, infertility, independence, anger, grief was seen not just as personal weakness, but as a political threat. And yet, in their letters, in their few surviving diaries, in their quiet acts of resistance, we see glimpses of humanity. Some queens wrote of their children with aching love. Others found solace in books, music, or gardens. A few, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, defied expectations, altogether ruling lands, managing armies, and outliving kings. But even she could not escape the demands placed upon her body. She bore 10 children. You lie in the darkness of your chamber and count the days until birth. Every movement in your womb makes you flinch. What will happen if the child is born silent? Will they light the candles or extinguish them? Will the bells ring or toll? You whisper a prayer not for the strength to rule, but for the strength to survive. And still, somewhere deep inside, you ask the question no one dares to voice aloud. Is this power, or is it a sentence? The child is born. The chamber smells of sweat, blood, and wet linen. Midwives bustle around, whispering prayers and instructions. The baby cries aloud, ragged wayland. The physician exhales in relief. It is a boy. The kingdom rejoices. Bells are rung, messengers are dispatched to the edges of the realm. The midwives carefully wrap the child in clove gold. He is taken to the wet nurse and disappears down the corridor. You, still bleeding and broken, are forgotten for a while. Your duty is fulfilled. You have succeeded for now, and yet the fear does not leave you. For royal women in the Middle Ages, even a healthy son did not guarantee safety. What if the child dies young? What if he is murdered, or stolen, or used as a pawn in another lord's scheme? What if the king dies before the boy can rule? And worst of all, what if you cannot do it again? Even the most powerful queens were disposable if they failed to produce multiple heirs. One son was not enough. They needed a spare, and preferably a few daughters to marry off for diplomacy. Queens who bore only girls were seen as cursed, or at the very least, disappointing. Royal mothers walked a knife's edge between triumph and irrelevance. Once the birthing years ended, a woman's position became even more precarious. Menopause was not a word they used, but they understood what it meant. A womb that no longer bled was a womb that no longer mattered to politics. No more children meant no more leverage. In some cases, older queens wielded surprising power as if their sons took the throne, they could become queen mothers, trusted advisors, guardians of tradition, and political anchors during uncertain reigns. Eleanor of Provence, the mother of Edward I, continued to influence court life long after her childbearing years ended. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, was instrumental in establishing the Tudor dynasty and remained an influential presence in her son's court. But these were rare women, navigating a landscape designed to erase them. More often, queens faded into quiet seclusion. Some were sent to convents not as punishment, but as a polite form of political retirement. Others retreated to castles in the countryside, kept comfortable but irrelevant. They embroidered, prayed, and waited for letters from their children. One such woman was Queen Berengaria of Navarre, the widow of Richard the Lionheart. After his death, she lived for decades in France, mostly ignored by the English crown. She had no children, no political capital, and no place in the new regime. Her royal status became a memory, an embroidered title with no land beneath it. And then there were queens who died in childbirth, never seeing the children they gave everything to deliver. Jean III of Navarre died giving birth to a future king. So did Elizabeth of York, mother of Henry VIII. In their deaths, their wombs were praised more than their lives. Their tombs were carved with symbols of fertility, cradles, vines, and royal crests, but their thoughts, fears, and personalities were rarely recorded. You begin to understand that history, for royal women, was written around their bodies, not through their voices. The legacy of medieval royal mothers is etched in genealogies, not memoirs. We remember who they birthed, not who they were. And yet, their influence was vast. Each child they bore reshaped the lines of succession. Each miscarriage altered political alliances. Their pain, their sacrifice, and their endurance were silent. Forces that built kingdoms. It is easy to forget this, to believe they simply reclined on silk pillows while the world turned. Behind every war for the throne, every disputed claim, and every fragile peace treaty, there was a woman who had risked her life again and again to keep a lineage alive. Even in their silence, they mattered. Now, imagine standing in an empty chamber where a queen once gave birth. The rushes have been swept clean, the cradle is gone. A faint scent of lavender lingers. No one speaks of the tears she shed, or the prayers she whispered. But her son rules now. Her blood sits on the throne. She does not appear in paintings. Her portrait was never finished, but her ghost remains, not as a queen in jewels, but as a woman who survived or died, so that a kingdom could continue. So, as you drift deeper into thought or sleep, consider this: when a woman's worth is measured by the lives she produces, not the life she lives, what legacy is truly hers? The curse of the midwife, between witchcraft and survival, it is late, and the stars hang low over the village like pale lanterns. The wind moves through the thatched roofs and stone chimneys, and a dog barks at nothing. A knock comes at your door. You rise from your bed, tie a shawl over your shoulders, and take the satchel that never leaves your side. You do not ask who it is, you already know. Someone is in labor. You are the midwife. Your steps crunch softly on the frost-covered path. As you make your way toward the woman's home, you've done this dozens of times, sometimes with joy, sometimes with fear. Tonight, you feel both. The woman is young, and this is her first child. The husband is pacing. The mother-in-law is praying. The girl is screaming. There are no surgeons here, no clean beds, no anesthesia. You bring with you boiled water, a knife, linen cloths, crushed herbs, and quiet words. You have seen children born in blood, in silence, in screaming, and in stillness. You know how to feel for a baby's position by hand. You know how to wrap a cord around a tiny neck and slip it free. You know how to tell the truth without saying it. In the Middle Ages, midwives were not just healers, they were survival itself. In a world where hospitals were rare, expensive, and often dangerous, midwives were the only hope for most women. They worked in the margins of medicine and superstition, balancing what they knew with what they could not control. Many were uneducated, trained through apprenticeship, through experience, or through desperation. Others were literate and skilled in folk medicine, familiar with herbs and anatomy in ways physicians were not, but their knowledge made them dangerous. The Church never fully trusted women who dealt in birth and blood. Though midwives were necessary, they were often viewed with suspiciousness. If a child died, or a mother bled too much, or a birthmark looked like a devil's kiss, it was easier to blame the midwife than to face the reality that childbirth was simply perilous, that nature could not always be guided. This unease turned, in time, to fear. By the 13th and 14th centuries, midwives found themselves caught in a growing web of accusation. If a child was stillborn, people whispered that the midwife had cursed it. If a woman died in labor, it was said she had helped her cross to the other side too soon. If a baby thrived, despite impossible odds, maybe the midwife had struck a deal with darker forces. There was a term for women like that, which dot in Germanic and Slavic regions, especially. Midwives were closely associated with witchcraft. Manuals, like the Malleus Maleficarum published in 1487, described in excruciating detail how witches supposedly harmed pregnancies, murdered infants, and stole newborn souls. Midwives were listed among the most likely suspects. The very tools they used, knives, powders, whispered prayers, were reinterpreted as dark instruments of the devil. And so the knock at midnight became a threat as much as a calling. Some midwives were lucky, protected by their communities and respected as wise women. Others found themselves accused, tortured, and burned. In France, a midwife named Perrin Gogoulan was executed in 1679 on charges of witchcraft after a newborn died in her care. Her tools were confiscated and displayed as evidence of sorcery. She had served her village for 20 years, and yet women kept coming to the midwife's door, because what was the alternative? A male doctor, if one could be found or afforded, might refuse to touch a woman during labor. Some physicians insisted on attending from behind a curtain, shouting instructions while servants handled the birth. Others had no idea what to do. Many avoided childbirth altogether, considering it beneath them. You, the midwife, know better. You've touched life and death with your bare hands, and still you must be careful. In some towns, you are required to report births to the local priest within hours. If you perform emergency baptisms for infants near death, you must use exactly the right words or face accusations of heresy. If you administer herbs to dull pain, someone may say you're interfering with divine punishment. If a baby is born with a deformity, you may be accused of summoning evil, so you work in whispers and shadows. You hold lives in your arms and let them go, without thanks, without protection, and often without pay. You know that your hands are not evil, but strong, that your knowledge is not witchcraft, but hard-earned wisdom. Still, as the baby arrives, tonight, Covered in blood and crying strong, you offer up a silent prayer, not just for the child, but for yourself. That no one dies, that no one blames you. You clean your tools and return to your cottage before dawn. Another knock may come tomorrow. Another life may begin. Another death may follow. You will be there either way. But the question lingers, like a shadow behind your door, when knowledge becomes suspicion and survival becomes sin. How long can a woman walk the line between healer and heretic? You wake with a start. The dream lingers, faces in the dark, fire on your skin, and the distant sound of crying. You're not sure if it was a memory or a warning. The year is 1592. Somewhere in the German-speaking lands, a midwife is about to stand trial. Her name might be forgotten in history, or recorded only as the old woman or the widow who lived by the river. But what is remembered, what is always remembered, are the charges. A child died, and the midwife was there. The baby had a twisted leg, and someone said it was cursed. The mother bled too long after birth, and the midwife prayed in a language no one recognized. That was all it took. In some places, the accusation of witchcraft required no physical evidence at all. Rumors, old grudges, or the convenient death of an infant were enough to bring a woman before a tribunal. If she had served many families in the village, her experience might be used against her. She always knows too much. She never gets sick. She works alone. Familiarity became suspicion. Respect became fear. The charges often sounded like this: practicing midwifery without the blessing of the church, administering unapproved herbs, performing rituals that resembled pagan practices, possessing amulets or books of knowledge, baptizing babies in an unorthodox manner, knowing the names of too many women's secrets. In Bamberg, Wurzburg, Trier, and other towns swept by hysteria, midwives were among the most frequently accused during witch panics. Local officials documented how some women, often over 40, were rounded up in groups, tortured, and executed. The very tools of their trade, scissors, poultices, small knives, were paraded before judges as evidence of dark magic. Once accused, it was nearly impossible to escape. Trials relied heavily on confessions, and confessions were extracted under pressure. Verbal coercion, public humiliation, and more often, torture. The rack, thumbscrews, and sleep deprivation were common. After days of agony, a woman might admit to anything just to make it stop. She might even name other midwives, hoping it would buy her mercy. Sometimes the confessions read like horror stories. I flew on a broom to a gathering of women in the woods. I used the baby's afterbirth in a potion, I whispered. Satan's name during the birth pains. I cursed the child so it would not survive. None of it had to be true. It only had to be said, and the public listened. Imagine the square filled with townsfolk. Her hair is cut short. Her arms are bruised. She looks like someone they almost remember. But fear has erased compassion. The priest reads her crimes. A bell tolls. The execution might be by fire, as was common in many witch trials across Europe. Or she might be drowned, hanged, or burned in effigy. Sometimes her body was buried outside consecrated ground, stripped of Christian rites. Afterward, the silence returns. People go back to their homes, but the loss is real. A woman who had once held life in her hands is gone. And now, when labor begins, fewer doors open in the night. Not every midwife met this fate, of course. In more progressive towns and cities, others formed quiet networks, supporting each other in secret. A few even helped women escape, cross borders, into monasteries, or into the anonymous sprawl of a larger city. The church, too, was not a single voice. In some places, bishops worked alongside midwives, offering them legitimacy and oversight. Manuals were printed with approved prayers and instructions for emergency baptisms. A few midwives were even officially licensed. But even in these better cases, control was the price of survival. A midwife who wished to keep her role had to submit to inspections, follow religious protocol, and report every irregularity. She could not work with herbs unless permitted. She could not comfort a dying mother with anything but sanctioned prayers. Her skill was monitored, not celebrated, and through it all, the danger remained, because beneath every accusation was a deeper fear that women might know too much, that they might heal without men, that they might touch the beginning and end of life, and do it without permission. You begin to realize that the trials were not just about witches, they were about control, about silencing those who understood the secret rhythms of the body, about making sure that knowledge stayed in the hands of priests and doctors. Like smoke in the air after a pyre has burned out, when the world fears the power you hold in your hands. How do you keep that power from slipping through your fingers? The fire is long gone now. The ashes have scattered. The square is empty, but you still feel it's the weight of what was lost when the midwife vanished from the center of the village. As the 17th and 18th centuries passed, the great European witch hunts slowly declined. Skepticism grew. Courts began demanding more substantial evidence, and some officials started to question whether these executions served any real purpose or justice. The laws didn't change overnight, but the hysteria faded like the last light of a candle. And yet, for midwives, the world they returned to was no longer the same. The fear had done its work in some places. Midwives were still present, still needed, still respected, but they were also increasingly pushed into the margins. Male physicians with university degrees, the backing of medical guilds, and a growing body of printed knowledge began to take over the field of childbirth. They called themselves man midwives or accoucheurs, and they came with forceps, gowns, and the support of noble households and urban hospitals. Suddenly, childbirth was no longer a sacred, hidden ritual between women. It became a medical event, supervised by men in powdered wigs and clean gloves. The midwife, with her calloused hands and herbal satchel, began to look old-fashioned. Her knowledge, once essential, was now seen as unscientific. Her experience, once passed down through generations, was now dismissed as superstition. Even royal courts began to shift. In 1737, the famous Scottish man midwife, William Smellie, published diagrams and treatises on childbirth, laying the foundations for modern obstetrics. His work was revolutionary, but it also erased countless unnamed women whose lived experience had guided births for centuries. By the 1800s, in many urban centers of Europe, midwives had been reduced to assistants or were removed entirely. This transition wasn't just about medicine. It was about power and who was allowed to wield it. It was about the professionalization of knowledge and the price of admission. Women who could not attend universities or hold licenses were quietly excluded. Even as some countries introduced training programs for midwives, they were often designed and controlled by male institutions. The midwife was allowed to exist so long as she did not lead, and yet she did not disappear in rural villages, mountain communities, and coastal hamlets. The midwife still walked the night paths. She still delivered babies in stormy barns and candlelit kitchens. She still knew how to tie a cord, brew a calming tea, and say the right words to a frightened mother. Her hands were still steady, even when society turned its back. In Scandinavia, some midwives were protected by law and even respected as local authorities. In parts of Italy and Spain, midwifery remained entwined with folk traditions and religious rites. In Eastern Europe, older women continued the role quietly, sometimes alongside new Christian practices, sometimes rooted in pre-Christian customs. And in places where medicine was scarce, the midwife never stopped being necessary. But there were other costs. The decline of traditional midwifery also meant the loss of generations of medical wisdom. Plants, whose names are now only found in folklore, were once part of childbirth kits. Techniques for turning breech babies or preventing hemorrhage using pressure points were passed down verbally and never recorded. When the last midwife in a village died, her knowledge often died with her by the 19th century. Many of these women had become ghost figures in history. They existed in old diaries, in whispers, in church records, marked with the word suspected. In rare cases, we find their names etched in court proceedings or in the margins of a medical text, almost always when something went wrong. And yet, in the modern world, we've slowly begun to remember them. Today, midwifery is once again a recognized and respected profession in many parts of the world. Trained midwives assist in hospitals, clinics, and homes. They work alongside doctors or independently, guided by science, tradition, and compassion. Their knowledge is backed by formal education and international standards. But even now, they face challenges. In some regions, midwives are still viewed with suspicion or restricted by law. In others, they are overwhelmed by medical bureaucracy. And in many poor or rural areas, they remain the only option. With little support, you may not see her, but the midwife is still there in the flicker of a hospital monitor, in the clasp of hands during labor, in the memory of those who were born quietly, without drama, in the care of someone who understood. Her story is one of survival across fire, fear, and silence. So tonight, as you lie back and drift to sleep, picture her, a woman in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders, tools at her waist, answering another knock in the night. And let this question settle in the hush before dreams. How many of our lives began in the hands of women history tried to erase? The wife's cage, marriage, obedience, and the law, asterisk, you are standing at the edge of a wooden hall. The air smells of straw, damp stone, and freshly poured wine. Laughter echoes off the rafters. At the center of the room, a woman in a plain gown bows her head while a priest recites Latin phrases she's been taught not to interrupt. To her right stands her husband, older by decades, gripping her wrist with ceremonial pride. The words sound holy, but you know what they mean. She no longer belongs to herself. In medieval Europe, marriage was not about love, it was a contract. And for women, that contract came with a long list of obligations, few rights, and little chance of escape. From the lowest peasant to the highest princess, once a woman was wed, she was legally bound to her husband's authority in nearly every aspect of life. Her body, her time, her labor, even her voice were now considered extensions of his will. It began with the doctrine of coverture, the idea that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. In practice, this meant that a wife could not own property, sue in court, or make contracts without her husband's permission. She could not leave the household without cause. She could not refuse her husband's demands in the bedroom. In the eyes of the law, they were one flesh, but only one of them spoke. Even before marriage, the choices were limited. Girls were often married off at 13 or 14, especially among the nobility. These unions were arranged by fathers or guardians who prioritized alliances, land, and wealth over compatibility. A young woman might be sent hundreds of miles away to live with a man she'd never met. If she refused, she could face punishment or be locked in a convent until she complied. For peasant women, things were slightly different, but still harsh. Marriages were often local, and a woman might have a say in choosing her husband. But even then, the social pressure was immense. Remaining unmarried beyond 20 could mark her as suspicious, untrustworthy, or worse, useless. And so, most entered the bond of marriage early, often without fully understanding what it would cost them. Inside the home, the wife became both servant and subject. Her duties included cooking, weaving, fetching water, cleaning, tending animals, and raising children, all while pregnant. Her husband, by contrast, could hold public office, join guilds, or own land. If he was abusive, her options were grim. Physical violence was legal in many places, so long as it wasn't considered excessive. Some law codes even specified the size of the stick a man could use to discipline his wife, and if she tried to flee, few doors opened. Runaway wives were sometimes hunted down like criminals. If caught, they were returned to their husbands or punished by public humiliation. In one German town, a woman who left her husband was forced to stand in the market square with a rope around her neck while passersby spat at her. In England, she might be put in the scold's bridle, a metal cage that locked around her head and clamped her tongue to silence. The church too often reinforced obedience. Preachers warned women to be humble, quiet, and submissive, citing biblical verses that described wives as subject to their husbands as unto the Lord. Marriage was considered sacred, but only if it maintained order, and order meant hierarchy. A disobedient wife was not just a household problem, she was a moral threat. Some women had kind husbands, some formed true partnerships, even friendships, but the structure remained deeply unequal, and the danger of that inequality was always present, like a silent hand pressed firmly on the back of the neck. As you close your eyes now, imagine the daily life of a woman in such a marriage. She rises before dawn to bake bread. She tends the children, carries buckets of water from the well, stitches a torn sleeve, and kneels to scrub the floor. At night, her husband may demand her companion her silence. There are no locks on her door, no laws to protect her wishes, no one to ask if she is content, and she is not alone. From the manor houses of Normandy to the dusty lanes of Florence, millions of women lived lives shaped by this same narrow mold. And while they may not have worn chains, the bonds were real. So, You begin to wonder, as the fire dies low and the stars rise, if a cage is made of vows and duty, not iron, is it any easier to escape? You might imagine that women in medieval marriages, silenced by law and scripture, simply submitted to their fate. But that's not quite true. If the medieval wife lived in a cage, it was often one she tested for weak bars, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a scream. The first and most common form of resistance was subtle. It started in the rhythms of daily life, a loaf of bread baked just a little later than usual, a task left unfinished, a quiet pause when asked to obey. These were not grand revolts, but they were moments of agency, tiny refusals to disappear completely. A wife might hide small coins from the household budget, secretly saving to support a child, a sister, or even herself if she had to flee. Others would barter privately, exchanging herbs, textiles, or gossip with neighbors, forming networks of trust that existed outside their husband's awareness. In some villages, women gathered at communal wells or markets to share news and warnings, often weaving quiet resistance into their everyday conversations. And then there were legal paths, rare, but not impossible. In certain regions, a woman could appeal to the church or the local court for something called separation from bed and board. This wasn't a divorce in the modern sense. She would still be married, but no longer had to live with or serve her husband. To succeed, she needed to prove extreme cruelty, abandonment, or, in some cases, impotence. It was a difficult road, and few succeeded. But some did. Take the case of Marjorie de Nerford in 14th century England. She brought her husband to court, alleging that he had tried to poison her and had taken up with another woman. The court listened. They ruled in her favor. She was granted separation and allowed to live in peace with her dowry restored. It was a rare win, but it showed that the system could be challenged even from within. Other women used different tools. Literacy, for example, became a quiet weapon. Though most peasant women could not read, some noble and urban women were taught to write letters, copy religious texts, or manage household accounts. This gave them access to knowledge, to correspondence, and to their own voice in a way few men expected. A well-placed letter written to a bishop or a noblewoman's cousin in court could change a household's fate. In Italy, women from merchant families sometimes used their math skills to run businesses in their husband's absence or against his will. In Florence, the records show wives negotiating with bankers and lawyers, asserting themselves in public, even while the law insisted they remain under the hand of their husbands. Even in the countryside, women found ways to resist cultural norms. Folk tales and songs passed from mother to daughter often featured clever wives outwitting foolish or cruel husbands. In some, a woman disguises herself to escape a forced marriage. In others, she tricks her husband into sharing his inheritance or granting her freedom. These weren't just stories. They were maps drawn in metaphor of how one might survive, and survival could sometimes turn into defiance. A wife might refuse to sleep with her husband. This was a risky move. Denying marital rights could be considered a sin or grounds for punishment. But it happened. In 15th century Paris, a woman named Catherine Lefebvre refused to share a bed with her husband for over 2 years, claiming he treated her as a stranger in her own home. When brought before the court, she spoke clearly and without shame. Her testimony, preserved in records, shows a startling degree of courage. She did not win her case, but she was heard in more extreme cases. Resistance turned violent. There are rare but vivid accounts of wives who fought back, sometimes with poison, sometimes with blades. In Germantown records, you'll find trials of women accused of killing abusive husbands. The courts almost always condemned them, but their stories remain. One woman confessed to placing poisonous herbs in her husband's beer after years of beatings. Another stabbed her husband in self-defense when he tried to burn her belongings in the yard. These women were not celebrated, but they were remembered. And then there were the public protests moments, when groups of women stepped beyond the home to demand change. In 15th century France, during a food shortage, women stormed grain carts to prevent their contents from being sold off. Many were married, many carried children on their hips, and many shouted that their husbands would not fight, but they would. They were arrested, some were whipped, but their names made it into the records, and their actions helped spark reforms. Even church convents became quiet refuges. Some women, especially widows, chose to live in religious houses, not just for faith, but for freedom. Within the convent walls, they could own property, read, write, and sometimes wield considerable power. Abbesses led communities, managed lands, and corresponded with kings. For a woman who'd known only silence in her marriage, this could feel like a rebirth. As the fire burns lower and the silence deepens, you might wonder about all the unnamed wives who found their own forms of rebellion. The ones who never made it into court records or letters, who never killed or sued, but who resisted in quiet, ordinary ways. They pulled thread through cloth, with their thoughts spinning faster than their needles. They kept secrets beneath the hearthstones. They taught their daughters to watch, to wait, and to question. And you might ask yourself now, if history forgets a rebellion because it wasn't lauded, it still changed the world. As the medieval world marched toward the early modern era, the rigid cage of marriage didn't shatter, but cracks began to form. Those cracks were small at first, and mostly invisible, but over time, they let in light. It started with the growing complexity of towns and cities. In rural villages, women had long been tied to the land, their labor folded into the household economy. But in expanding towns like Bruges, Ghent, and London, things shifted. More trades appeared, markets grew, and with them, so did the need for skilled hands. Urban women began stepping beyond their homes, not just to shop, but to work. In places like Florence, women became spinners, dyers, weavers, bakers, ale brewers. Though still under their husband's legal shadow, their income gave them a new kind of leverage. In some guilds, widows could inherit and operate their husband's workshop. In others, wives worked side by side with husbands and sons, becoming essential partners in business. This mattered because economic usefulness often created room for negotiation. A woman who brought income into the home had more say in how it was run. A merchant, SWIFE, in Lubeck might help manage shipping ledgers. A seamstress in York might train apprentices, gaining a reputation in her own right. And while the law hadn't yet caught up, practice sometimes outpaced it. Religion, too, began to shift. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century reshaped ideas about marriage. In regions influenced by Martin Luther, marriage was no longer seen as a sacrament. but a social contract. This opened new doors, sometimes literally. Protestant reformers criticized forced marriages and advocated for mutual consent, at least in theory. They also allowed, in rare cases, divorce. Not all gains were equal, and not all change was good. Protestantism closed convents, which had once been a refuge for many women, and patriarchal expectations remained strong. But the conversation had begun to change. People were asking what marriage should mean, not just what it had always been. Education followed close behind. Though female literacy was still rare, it began to climb. In certain Protestant areas, girls were taught to read scripture, an unintended revolution. With access to reading came exposure to new ideas, philosophy, law, theology. Some women began writing their own letters, poems, and even treatises on marriage. In England, a woman named Elizabeth Carey wrote a play called The Tragedy of Miriam in 1613, imagining a queen who dares to question her marriage and her king in France. A writer named Christine de Pizan had already laid groundwork centuries earlier. Her book of The City of Ladies asked why women were excluded from public life and whether obedience was truly a virtue. She was a rare voice, but one that echoed more loudly with each generation. And then came law. It took centuries, but gradual. Legal reforms chipped away at. In some regions, women gained the right to keep property after marriage, particularly if they entered with a strong dowry or business interest. Legal scholars began debating the fairness of automatic male authority. Courts occasionally sided with wives in property disputes, and by the 17th century, legal precedents in places like Scandinavia and the Dutch Republic hinted that the absolute rule of husbands might not be eternal. Still, change was slow. The average woman, especially in the countryside, felt little of this progress. Marriage remained a deeply patriarchal institution, and many wives continued to live within the same old framework of duty, silence, and dependence. But something had shifted. The wife of the late medieval period, though still caged by custom and code, now had more tools forged not from steel, but from skills, networks, words, and resilience. Her daughters might attend a city school. Her sons might marry for love. And her granddaughters might one day walk into court and speak not just for themselves, but for the women who never could. We often forget how gradual change is. We think of progress as a staircase, when really it's a long, worn path, sometimes so faint that you can barely see the footprints. But they're there. Each woman who questioned her husband's rule, each who taught her daughter to read, each who dared to complain out loud left a mark. They bent the bars, and in time, enough bending begins to break things open. So as the fire in the hearth fades, and the sound of footsteps quiets outside the stone walls, you're left with one more question to ponder. If the door to the cage is only half open, do you wait, or do you push? Midwives and mortality, the hidden world of childbirth, *. Imagine you are lying on a straw-stuffed pallet in a cold stone room. A thin sheet covering your belly, sweat dripping from your temples. The hearth fire is low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. You grip the rough hand of the midwife beside you and try to breathe through another wave of pain. There is no doctor, there is no anesthesia. Outside, no one even knows if you will live to see morning. This is childbirth in the Middle Ages. For most medieval women, pregnancy was not a gentle miracle, it was a looming threat. To become a mother was to step onto the threshold of death, and most women walked that path many times. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the average woman in Europe gave birth between 5 and 10 times in her life. But with each pregnancy came a terrifying gamble. Modern medicine estimates that maternal mortality in the medieval period could reach as high as 1 in 10 per birth in some regions. That means a woman who birthed 5 or 6 children had a very real chance of dying from it, and yet she had no choice. Marriage meant children, and children meant survival for the family, for the farm, for the lineage. The birthing chamber itself was a woman's domain. Men were not welcome, not husbands, not priests, not physicians. Instead, women turned to each other, mothers, sisters, neighbors, and especially midwives, the keepers of the oldest knowledge, passed down not in books but in whispered instructions, worn hands, and worn-out towels. The birthing room was dim, warm, and tightly enclosed. Windows were shuttered to keep out evil air. Blankets were hung over doorways. Candles flickered beside relics or crosses. A bowl of holy water might sit near the bedside, and always there was prayer, quiet, urgent, desperate. Women in labor clutched rosaries, whispered psalms, or cried out to saints like Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patroness of childbirth, who had once survived being swallowed by a dragon. But the tools of the trade were simple: a birthing wooden seat with a hole in the middle, herbal compresses, oil for lubrication, clean linens if you were lucky. A midwife might use rosemary, mugwort, or pennyroyal plants, known to ease cramps or slow bleeding. She knew the signs: when the child was turned wrong, when the mother bled too fast, when it was time to pray instead of push. There were no ultrasounds, no blood transfusions, no antiseptics. A difficult birth could last days, and when something went wrong, when the baby was breech, when the cord strangled, when the mother tore badly or hemorrhaged, there was often nothing to be done. In many cases, both mother and child died. In others, only one lived. Some women gave birth to stillborn babies again and again and again. And yet, women found strength in this terrifying ritual. Midwives were not just attendants, they were guardians. Their role was as sacred as it was secret. In most villages, the midwife was one of the only women trusted with public authority. She delivered babies. She anointed newborns if they seemed likely to die before baptism. She swore oaths before the church to protect mothers. And though she was not a priest, she sometimes stood between a soul and the grave. But with this power came suspicion. Midwives walked a delicate line. Too much knowledge, and people whispered about witchcraft. Too little success, and villagers blamed them for deaths. The church issued rules about how midwives should behave, especially during emergency baptisms. Inquisitors questioned whether some midwives used magic, and in the centuries to come, the same women who once brought life into the world would find themselves accused of consorting with the devil. And yet, in the moments of crisis, no one called for a bishop or doctor. They called for the midwife, because childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't just painful. It was a lonely, sacred, terrifying trial, a passage through blood and shadow, a moment when life and death touched hands, and when the baby cameth, it came the silence broke, a cry, perhaps, or only the wind against the shutter. And the midwife would say nothing at first. She would check, she would wait, and then she would speak the words the mother longed to hear. "It's alive." But even then, the danger was not over. So, as the mother lies there half awake, the baby wrapped and placed nearby, the midwife cleans her hands. And you might wonder what happens when the baby doesn't cry. And what does that mean for a soul not yet baptized? The candlelight flickers. A still silence hangs in the air. The midwife leans over the newborn, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Everyone in the room waits. But there's no cryingly, the faint rattle of shallow breath, or, worse, none at all. For medieval women, the moment after childbirth was as nerve-wracking as the labor itself. A child born into the world without signs of life was not just a tragedy, it was a crisis of the soul. According to the teachings of the medieval church, a baby who died unbaptized could not enter heaven. Instead, they were believed to be consigned to a place called limbo, a shadowy realm without torment, but also without the presence of God. For mothers, this wasn't abstract theology, was unbearable heartbreak. A silent infant meant eternal separation, no salvation, no comfort. This is why the midwife often doubled as a spiritual first responder. She had to act fast. If the baby showed any sign of life movement, sound, breath, she could perform an emergency baptism on the spot. A bit of clean water, a whispered invocation, and a soul could be saved. The ritual didn't require a priest, just the proper words. "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." Some midwives kept water close at all times. Others used wine, milk, even saliva, in desperation. If they believed the child had briefly lived even for a moment, they baptized. Because if they didn't, and the child died, that soul might never rest, and neither would the mother. It was not uncommon for women to bear children who died within hours or days. In some villages, newborn mortality reached nearly 1 in 3. Infection, weakness, birth defects, exposure to cold, or simple malnourishment all could steal a baby before it had a chance. Many mothers buried more children than they raised, and each burial came with the same doubts. Had they done enough? To ease these anxieties, the church encouraged proper burial rites. A baptized infant was given a name and a Christian grave, often in a cemetery near the church. Small white cloths were wrapped around the body. Family members, usually the mother and other women, tended in silence. There were no grand ceremonies, just tears, prayers, and earth. Unbaptized babies, however, faced a different fate. Church law forbade them from burial in consecrated ground. Instead, they were often interred outside churchyards, sometimes beneath trees, along boundary roads, or in unmarked graves. In parts of France and Italy, archaeologists have found hidden infant cemeteries, buried deep in farmland, unblessed and forgotten. These children weren't mourned in public. Their names were rarely recorded. They simply disappeared, and so did part of the mother. We often imagine medieval women as hardened by constant loss, but letters, poems, and even legal testimony reveal deep grief. In a 15th century English court record, a woman sued for a proper burial after her stillborn child was denied church rites. In a Germantown chronicle, a midwife confessed she had baptized a baby after death, just to ease the mother's pain, knowing It would not be accepted, but hoping God would understand. Some women turned to saints for comfort. Saint Anne, the Virgin Mary's mother, became a symbol of maternal suffering. Others prayed to Saint Margaret or Saint Bridget, hoping their child's soul might be spared. Superstitions grew, placing holy objects near the baby, whispering sacred words during labor, or tying protective charms around the mother's wrist. In some homes, mothers didn't name their newborns for several days, waiting to see if they would survive. Others reused the same name again and again, giving each new daughter the name of the one who had died before her. It was a way of holding on, even when nothing could be held. And yet, despite all of this, the death, the fear, the endless grief, women kept going. They bore child after child, knowing what might come. They endured the pain. They risked their lives, because motherhood, as terrifying as it was, gave women a role society couldn't deny. It granted them a place in family lineage, in village stories, in spiritual legacy. It made them indispensable. Even when the world gave them no voice, motherhood gave them meaning, but meaning comes at a cost. And in the cold silence after a failed birth, the question lingers: how many prayers must be said for the ones who never breathed? And what happens when a mother cannot forget what the church refuses to remember? The room is warm, dim, and thick with herbs. A woman kneels beside a new mother, pressing a cloth steeped in mugwort against her belly. She mutters a quiet prayer, checks for bleeding, and swaddles the newborn with care. Outside, a rooster crows. A new day begins. But soon, someone will knock at her door, and they won't come for her healing hands. They will come with suspicion. For centuries, midwives were essential figures in their communities. They were often the only women besides the mother allowed in the birthing room. They knew the rhythms of labor, the smell of infection, the feel of death approaching. Their knowledge came not from books, but from practice painstakingly passed down from one woman to the next. But by the late Middle Ages, this power began to feel dangerous. As Europe entered the 14th and 15th centuries, fear of heresy and magic began to spread. The Black Death had decimated the population. Famine, war, and disease shook belief in natural order. When things went wrong, when crops failed, children died, or labor went horribly awry, people looked for someone to blame. And women with knowledge became easy targets. The midwife, once revered as a life-giver, became suspect. She worked in secret. She said prayers and used herbs. Sometimes the baby lived, sometimes it didn't. And though the church had once allowed her to baptize, now they worried she was overstepping sacred roles, hiding sins, using charms. Was she helping or harming? By the 15th century, official manuals warned of midwives who used sorcery to ease childbirth or provoke abortions. Some were accused of invoking demons or making pacts with the devil. Others were charged with administering poisons. Of course, most of these poisons were common herbal remedies like ergot, pennyroyal, or rual, known to either induce labor or relieve pain. But male physicians, now rising in universities and courtly circles, viewed midwives with skepticism. Unlike the midwife, they had Latin texts, degrees, and ecclesiastical connections. Their rise to power in elite medicine meant pushing women out, and so midwives began to appear in trial records, punished, sometimes executed. In Germany, A woman named Walpurga Hausmannen was tortured into confessing she had killed over 40 infants with the devil's help. In France, another midwife stood trial for baptizing a stillborn child without permission. Her intention was mercy, but the Inquisition saw it as spiritual fraud. In parts of Spain, midwives were banned from even speaking religious words during birth, lest they cross into blasphemy. And yet, in every town, women still whispered their names in hope. The fear wasn't just about midwives, it was about control. Childbirth was one of the last spaces ruled entirely by women. In a society governed by male priests and doctors, that independence was threatening. What if women decided who lived or died? What if they could act outside church law? And so the birthing room, once sacred, became a battleground. Some midwives learned to tread carefully following church guidelines, swearing loyalty to bishops, keeping records of every baptism they performed. Others went underground, offering remedies in secret. Some disappeared from the record altogether, as male surgeons and barber physicians claimed authority over obstetrics in the Renaissance. But even with fear pressing in, many midwives remained defiantly rooted in their calling. They weren't witches, they were caretakers, they were survival. Their knowledge was born of long nights and bleeding hands. They had held dying mothers. They had buried infants. They had been the first to hear a baby's cry and the last to close a woman's eyes. They stood in the doorway between life and death and bore the weight of both. By the 17th century, the church began training licensed midwives, but even these women faced stigma. In some places, they were monitored like criminals. In others, they were quietly ignored. But the truth never left the memory of mothers, even today. In old villages across Europe, you'll hear stories of the wise woman, the old healer, the birth lady. Sometimes her name is lost, but her role remains. She was the one you called when the pain came, when no one else knew what to do. And in this long, quiet story of forgotten names and silent deaths, you might begin to wonder what happens to a world that forgets the women who once brought it life, and how many of those stories still lie buried, unspoken, beneath our feet.